Big boy loves fun decks. Big boy loves making news. Big boy loves fun decks in making news. Hi everyone. Abram Job, also known as the Big Boy, has recently given me this making news list that seems like a lot of fun to play. Yeah, it's not degenerate or anything, and it's pretty good, I must say. So if you haven't checked out my previous video where I talk about corp identities, be sure to do so, because in there I make the point that making news in NBN is actually an identity that soups up some of your ice. It improves their stats and makes them more playable. I'm talking about IP block and throw here. These two ice, which usually can be trivially passed by beating the trace, are now a lot more taxing when you add on the 2 trace credits from making news. Coupled with Archangel and pop-up window, you now have a critical mass of very cheap to res ice that is incredibly taxing for the runner to pass. And this is quite important because this entire deck is based on taxing the runner's credits. Even if they may be running 3 copies of Termusian contract, they'll realize that the economy is soon drained when they have to keep passing these ice time after time again. In conjunction with the defensive capabilities of Ash and NAPD, you have a very taxing deck. A lot more so than at first glance. You might look at this and think this ice is too cheap, too flimsy, too porous. And in some sense you're right. But as we will soon witness, this deck will tax the heck out of the runner, so sit back and enjoy. Alright, let's go. We are up against Andromeda today, with 2 opening ice in my opening hand and a hedge fund. I don't see a reason to throw this hand, and when I mandatory draw into another ice, it only seems obvious to show up all 3 central servers defense. This way, there will be no Termusian, no Mobius to worry about. My opponent can only install a Desperado and do a blind dirty laundry on the Tribunal. Tribunal is 7 to res and I only have 5 credits because I did not play the hedge fund. Well, looks like I concede the first agenda to my opponent. This is not ideal. If my opponent siphons me here, if they're smart enough to do that, I'm in a deep, deep hole. But thankfully, they don't see that. So I'm going to be able to drop here, play the hedge fund, and then take a credit because I don't really have any place to install the troll just yet. Troll can be installed on any of my central servers, but I would like to wait and adopt a wait and see approach. Wait for my opponent to actually review the Termusian before icing the appropriate server. Now my opponent runs HQ here, again defiant, thinking that the ice isn't going to do much to them. Well, they're wrong. The Tribunal hits, and this is going to be nasty. It's time to lay down the verdict.
Guilty, 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 guilty!
So let's assess the libel charges incurred by Andromeda. She lost a daily cast with 6 credits on it, a Desperado that was about to give her 1 credit on a successful run. Plus the 3 credits from installing the Desperado. That's a total of 10 credits down the drain for a 7 res cost Tribunal. I don't know about you, but I say that's pretty effective. So yeah, I was very, very happy with the outcome. It's not a complete blowout. Andromeda's still in the game, but boy did I set her back. So, back to my opponent, who now sets up a security testing with Turning Wheel. Note that if my opponent had a Desperado, that security testing is going to go a long way, considering that it's only pop-up windows that are guarding archives and R&D. You'll be sure that my opponent will start poking archives and other servers as well, because they have security testing and they have Fairy to protect them against destroyers and the like. In the meantime, I'm going to make my troll work for me. With a troll on the remote, I can deter my opponent from running it, and this will allow me to chalk up some much needed cash with launch campaign. Arguably, I should have jammed the Bill in there instead. I would have been able to score the Bill, and that would have been a viable scoring window. Plus, I wouldn't have to worry about Aaron Maron, who finally now hits the table. So any agenda scored or stolen from this point on will be Aaron Maron. It will incur Aaron Maron counters. Now, my opponent actually can very easily get through my remote server. They don't know this, but they can actually get through my remote very easily because there's no hard end run, it's just a troll. I'm banking on the hidden information on my ice, coupled with perhaps a misplay on my opponent's part. There's no reason for them not to face check it, and that would have forced me to pump the trace up pretty high, at which point they can simply click through the troll, bypass the Ash and then steal my sales team, but they don't, and as a result I get a free corporate sales team. Now this agenda is going to be huge. It's going to give me enough money to play the rest of the game, to res my Turbos and Archangels, and more importantly, to pump all the important tracers. Unfortunately, I'm going to lose some of this money right now as my opponent account siphons me. After getting the Iron Marin counters, it makes sense for my opponent to go for the siphon, and that was a very good play by my opponent. As such, I had to decide whether to dump all my money in the throw or not. Given that I have 10 credits in my pool, it would be pretty silly to dump all of them just to duck the siphon. Not to mention that I have 9 more credits on sales team, so I'm going to recover economically anyway. I'm gonna let my opponent do this siphon. It does cost them the ferry, so it's not the end of the world. They still have to find the sentry breaker. Unfortunately, yes, this is a big tempo swing for my opponent. They essentially, on that run, gained 10 credits. Yeah? And they didn't even need to pay for the tags because Iron Marin clears the tags. So that was a big plus for my opponent. They managed to get a burst amount of income without the need to even install Temujin contracts. So, what's my goal here? I need to search for more ice so that I can score my Bill. I don't find ice, but I find a Sand, and that's equally as good as scoring a Bill. I mean, finding ice to score the Bill in. So I'm going to drop the Sand here and continue receiving my drip money from sales team. You notice that even though I got siphon last turn, I'm back to 10 credits. This pop-up window here is going to do massive work. My opponent is forced to drop the Temujin on R&D. And that's a very good thing for me because it means that I'm gaining lots and lots of cash. Unfortunately, because it is R&D, my opponent also accumulates a bunch of turning wheel counters. So this leaves me very vulnerable to a sudden multi-access from my opponent. And not to mention that my opponent is now really rich. With the couple of Temujin runs, they are now on 13 credits and can easily contest this throw remote even past the making news credits and trash Sand. So what do I do from here? Now, I try to draw here. If I found ice here, I would definitely ice up R&D. I cannot allow my opponent to get such a good economic lead over me. Once my opponent empties that Temujin, it's game over for me. The whole point of this deck is to tax my opponent out. So the next best thing I can do if I can't tax them with ice is to tax them with upgrades. I'm going to drop an Ash Sand in the remote. My opponent knows this. It's transparent. Friends show that my opponent the contents of the install. So I'm basically forcing my opponent to run my server here. If they don't, I'm going to score something on the server. And my opponent says, well, I don't really care. I'm going to attack R&D instead. This is probably a mistake. Granted, my opponent might not have found something to break the tribunal on HQ, but clearly the right move here would have been to run R&D a bunch of times and then run HQ to multi-access to clear my hand of any potential Astro scripts or Bills, which in this case would have netted my opponent a very good shot at outright winning, given that I have 3 more agenda points in hand. Instead, my opponent goes for R&D for the big multi-access and does get an Astro script off of it, not before hitting an Archangel though. The Archangel cost my opponent a bit of money to break. So unfortunately, I lose the Astro script and concede match point to my opponent. So we are on 4 to 6 right now. This is a very dicey position for me. Even though my opponent's not completely set up, they haven't found their Sentry Breaker, they haven't found their Corroder. Unfortunately, with the amount of agendas my opponent has seen, given the very lightly defended R&D, and the amount of agendas I've scored, which has powered Iron Marin, what we have in this current situation is a position for my opponent to just search up the rest of the deck very quickly for cards they need. My opponent blew through the Iron counters, drawing 5 cards, jeez. If they were searching for something, well, they've probably found it by now. This puts me at a huge disadvantage. My opponent is very much favoured to win at this point. The problem is, I did not manage to draw enough of my ice, the good ice at that. Archangel and Tollbooth are incredibly essential against the criminal matchup due to them being high strength code gates. The fact I did not manage to find them quickly enough meant that they could empty the Temujin, get a very good siphon off, and just leave me in the dust. Speaking of getting siphons off, my opponent's at it again. Same situation, I'm stuck at the awkward point of having about 10 credits in my credit pool, and still a bit of money on the sales team. I can't afford to dump all my credits into the trace to duck the siphon, yet at the same time, giving my opponent the siphon is really bad. With 1 iron counter, they're able to clear off a tag easily, clear the other tag manually, and now they're on 16 credits. Enough money to contest this Ash server. Now that I've already used my making news credit on the troll, I'm not able to pump up this second throw as much as I would like to. As a result, my opponent gets in, not before the Ash fires. It is pretty taxing on my opponent still, but this was definitely not ideal. So it's quite interesting here. Yeah, my opponent had to pay through his nose to destroy both of the Ash and the Sand, which was really nice. The Friends was really coming into play here. Just completely wiped out my opponent's siphon credits. 5 to trash the Sand, 3 to trash the Ash, 3 to break the Ash trace, 1 to break the Troll trace. Whew, that is really, really taxing. So, yeah, my opponent could not let the Sand stay. One possible option was to run through the Troll, let the Ash fire, and just trash the Ash, and then come back for the Sand next turn. The problem with doing that is next turn, my NBN credits would refresh, and more importantly, I had 2 credits left. I could easily score another 2-pointer on the Sand before my opponent got to trash the Sand. So yeah, my opponent made the right play there. They had to kill the Sand Ash, but that set their money back quite a large amount. And that's what's amazing about this deck. Just a simple troll and double upgrade setup can cost the opponent so much to trash, and it's a must trash. It's not like, say, Breaker Bay Grid and Eve, where you can choose to ignore it and still have a decent shot at winning. You have to trash the Sand, and if it's guarded by Ash, well, you suck it up. You have to trash it. Now again, my opponent gets a second Temujin off, and I really need to defend Archives this time. I have a lot of money to defend it, thanks to my opponent frequently running my pop-ups. These pop-ups are doing so much work for me. Unfortunately, they are not enough to stop the Temujins. So my opponent is as rich as me, and that's not very good. How am I going to score the last agenda if my opponent's rich enough to contest my remote? This is a big problem. Thankfully, my opponent doesn't make the right play. Instead of denying my win condition, which is contesting the Sand in the Troll remote, they instead decide to show up all their money. Not sure if they're trying to set up for a big vamp or something. Clearly my opponent's looking to win via R&D. They drop a fam here, famming the outer eyes of R&D even before I res it, kind of knowing that it was going to be Archangel, but they were willing to dedicate an entire fam on it, and legwork? That's a very odd choice. Okay, so my opponent legworks me last click. I completely expected R&D run instead. But my opponent does not realize that Troll is actually not a subroutine. The trace fires regardless. Because my opponent dumps so much money into installing the fam, I now have the credit advantage in conjunction with the pop-up windows firing all the time. I'm able to actually outtrace my opponent on the Troll. This is a big problem. I'm gonna dump just enough credit such that my opponent cannot beat the Troll trace and break Tribunal all in the same go. And this is a big problem. Usually this is not a problem for runners. If they don't run last click, they can choose to lose a click instead of ending the run. But because my opponent went for the final click legwork, this was a very fatal error for my opponent. They now have to choose between letting Tribunal fire or fizzling the legwork. This is a very tough choice for my opponent. If they let Tribunal fire, they will go down to 0 credits. They will lose a lot of cards from their board. Are they willing to do it? That's the big question. And yeah, the correct answer is yes, obviously, because what my opponent doesn't know is that I have the winning 15 minutes in hand. Legwork would give them a 3 in 4 shot at winning, but instead, they jack out, and this gives them a John Masnori tag. So here I have to consider trashing my opponent's resources, but at this point, trashing resources doesn't help me win. My opponent is rich enough to run away with the game, so instead, I'm going to try to win myself. Having top decked the build that I needed to win, I'm going to fast advance it to bring myself up, equalizing the score at 6-6. We are now both on match point, and the game will go to whoever finds this 15 minutes. Granted, this means that R&D is up for grabs. If there's an agenda on top of R&D, I'm just gonna lose. But my hope is that having fizzled one of my opponent's legworks, and having drained the turning wheel counters earlier on, I hope that my opponent cannot actually win. If they don't find anything on R&D, there's a very good chance I'm going to win. So I'm going to res Archangel here. If I don't res it, my opponent will suspect that there's something going up on HQ. So I have to res the Archangel here. Knowing that my opponent will continue to R&D anyway, it will give me the pop-up credit to score 15 minutes on or off the Sand either way. So I was okay with this. My opponent ran R&D twice. Access the top card, do not hit. That's very good for me. Unfortunately, because my opponent has the turning wheel, they can now decide to go for triple access on R&D or HQ, Maker's Eye or legwork. My opponent went for the right one. It was the legwork. My opponent has a 75% chance of winning at this point. They can easily get through both eyes. I don't have the money to keep them out this time round, but I'll still pump a lot of money into it. Again, since this is last click run, I'm just going to spend 4 credits, leaving myself on 1. I can score the 15 minutes with just 1 credit. So again, 75% chance to win for my opponent, 25% chance for me. Not the best odds, but well, I can't really ask for much better given that I was in such a disadvantaged position coming into the mid game. It's all down to excess luck now, just like traditional Netrunner. Am I gonna win? Is it my opponent? Access? Oh, they got it on the very first access. Well, at least we put up a good fight. Was this close to an underdog victory? Well, you notice that even though my opponent won, that was off the back of 2 very powerful money cards, Temujin contracts and siphons. 2 Temujins and 2 siphons give you, what, 20 plus 32, 52. My opponent had 52 credits, and they still ended the game on just 2 credits. How crazy is that? My opponent had so much money, yet I was able to tax the majority of it. That's crazy. Most other decks can't do this. Well, had one of her stolen agendas been an NAPD contract, the game might have been different. Again, my opponent wouldn't have the money to make the Hail Mary HQ run in that case. Yeah, and that comes down to me actually making a very small deck tweak. I decided to swap one of the NAPDs in the deck, going down to 2, for a corporate sales team, because it seemed pretty good, and indeed, it did help me in the early game. When I scored it as my first agenda, the 10 credits went a very long way towards defending against my opponent. Unfortunately, that might have also cost me the game. So yeah, NAPD is actually a very important agenda, and after conversing with the big boy, I realized that it is actually one of the keystones of this deck. The ability to stay so defensive, and NAPD being actually one of the few ways you score out in the mid to late game. If you have an NAPD and Ash and your opponent breaks their back trying to go for a Hail Mary run, well, you get a free agenda out. That's pretty amazing. Now, what about my ice? I blame most of my loss on not drawing the correct ice this game. While the tribunal hit was crazy and the pop-ups did a lot of the load carrying, unfortunately, the ice that I really wanted to see just didn't come up. Archangel fired on R&D, that was nice, but that was a bit too little too late. This deck runs 3 copies and I entirely expect to see one early on to defend against either Siphon or the Temujin runs, and it just didn't happen this game. As for the barrier breaker, my opponent never needed to install a fractor, and that would have been a tempo hit that would have swung the game in my favor. All I needed to do was to find one of my 4 barriers, which I didn't manage to either. So yeah, the ice was rather unfortunate, I must say. Even though I got the ideal start of triple ice, pop-up tribunal, I wasn't able to carry on this advantage to the late game because I didn't draw the rest of the ice that I needed in succession. But that's how it is. I can't be too ashamed of how this game panned out. It was pretty good, and the deck was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this game. So hopefully you did too. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy net running. I'll see you next time.
Guilty, 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 guilty.